Thanks a lot. Yes, we had a conversation in the garden in Taizé this summer, and one thing led to the other, and here I am. Actually, I came over also to see my family in Philadelphia, to do some other things, and to vote, last but not least, to be part of this big adventure that people are talking about. Before I start, I just want to mention, I don't know how many people picked out the wonderful Freudian slip on the prayer thing. Did you get that? Did you see the top line of the... Midday payer service, so you can just we'll just pass around the hat and then you can all leave now. So at a time when in Europe especially, I'm not sure how different it is over here, but at a time when in Europe young adults are not exactly flocking to the mainstream Christian churches, I really do have the privilege of belonging to a monastic community that welcomes tens of thousands of mostly young visitors in the course of a year. They come for a week-long experience of prayer and community life. These young people, usually we call young people between 17 and 30, although that 30 is kind of expanding in the upper direction. They come from all over the world. They spend a week together on our hill in Burgundy, and then they return to their own realities, their own homes, to continue their own Christian and spiritual journey, each in his or her own way. So it's, I think, a good thing to reflect with you today on the significance of this phenomenon, especially insofar as it concerns prayer. The focus is going to be the experience of worship in Taizé, even though Taizé is more than just a community of prayer, as hopefully will be clear. Some people hope or expect or dream that my community could offer some sort of model able to be applied to other situations, a kind of secret for bringing young people to pray. In fact, that goes back a long way, that kind of hope. Pope Paul VI, about 40 years ago, something like that, when he had one of his, Brother Roger, our founder, had one of his yearly audiences with the Pope. The Pope asked him if he could give him the key to relating to young people, and Brother Roger was kind of taken aback and said, "I don't have that key and I'll never have it." And so anyone who's expecting a secret recipe for attracting young people are going to be disappointed. We don't feel that we have any kind of key or recipe. In fact, I think we've been just as surprised as anyone else about what has grown up around Taizé in the past years. So what I'd like to do with you today is to tell you a little more about who we are and what we do, and maybe try to explain a bit the reasons why, and maybe that can help us to reflect together on the meaning and importance of worship, especially with the younger generations. And then hopefully there'll be a time at the end for some feedback and some insights, questions, maybe your own thoughts will help to go further about this. So just like to lay out a little bit who we are and what we do, and then kind of have some sharing. I need probably, even though we're going to focus on prayer, I need probably to give a brief introduction to the Taizé community just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. People use the word Taizé in North America, we've noticed, to say different things. For many people, the word Taizé refers to a kind of singing, which you heard earlier if you're here for the prayer. These short phrases, often in Latin, repeated over and over again. That's all they know. They think we must be a group of musicians or something. Taizé is a kind of music. Maybe more common is to use the word Taizé to refer to the kind of communal prayer that we celebrated together, using these chants together with scripture readings, time of silence, an atmosphere, a peaceful, meditative atmosphere. And so people call that Taizé. So I used to be surprised. People would say, "I'm going to Taizé this evening." And I thought, how are they going to take the plane to France this evening? What they meant was they're going to attend one of these services. But we have to put first things first. Taizé is the name of a tiny village in eastern France where my community is located, a monastic ecumenical community, that is, brothers from different countries and different Christian traditions. We date the beginning to August of 1940, when a young man from Switzerland named Roger came to that village, and his first reason was to welcome refugees, especially Jews who were fleeing the Nazis. He spent 2 years there together with his sister, hiding refugees and helping them to cross the border into neutral Switzerland. But Roger's reason for coming to Taizé went beyond the immediate political context. He was motivated by the dream of a community that would be a sign of reconciliation among divided Christians and, as a consequence, a sign of peace in a war-torn world. After 2 years, Brother Roger left Taizé and went back to Switzerland. He met 3 other men there who shared his vision, and as soon as it became possible, the 4 young men returned to Taizé and began living a life which was inspired by the great monastic tradition of Western and Eastern Christianity. This was a bit surprising since they were all from the Reformed tradition, so there was no background in monasticism. They would pray 3 times a day from the beginning. They worked to support themselves, and again offering hospitality. In the post-war years, they welcomed about 20 orphans and raised them, along with Brother Roger's sister, who became their kind of surrogate mother. They visited a German prisoner of war camp, which was located in the area. And in 1949, when there were 7 of them, they made a life commitment to celibacy, material and spiritual sharing, and making their decisions in common, so the great monastic promises. In the 1950s, Taizé was a place of prayer, work, and hospitality that welcomed clergy and laity concerned about the ecumenical vocation, particularly the search for unity among the divided followers of Christ. At the same time, some brothers went out to live in small groups in places of poverty and division. Already at that time, the brothers were coming from different Protestant traditions, and then from the Anglican Communion, and then because of the new climate following the Second Vatican Council, it became in the mid-60s possible for Roman Catholic brothers to join the community. So today we're about 100 brothers coming from about 30 different countries. Most of us as myself, live basically in Taizé when we're not traveling, but we do have 4 small groups now located in Brazil, Senegal, South Korea, and Bangladesh. There's someone here who was in Korea and knows one of our brothers, taught with one of our brothers in Seoul. So we're located in these small groups around the world as well. Up till now, I haven't said anything about the younger generation. It should be clear from what I've been saying that Taizé did not begin as a place of meeting for young people. None of us have had any formal training in youth ministry. Already in the late 1950s, there were some work camps for young people and other gatherings occasionally, but in fact it was those changes in society and culture that we associate with the 1960s that brought the young people and Taizé together. In the course of the late 60s and early 70s, the numbers of young adults who visited Taizé mushroomed. It was a kind of spontaneous thing, people telling their friends. Why they came was very diverse. Everyone was searching, but in different ways, searching for a better world, searching for peace and justice, searching for a deeper and more relevant faith, trying to find their place in society, looking for others with a common vision, but I think especially wanting to be listened to and to be taken seriously. They came to Taizé like they came to many places. Possibly they were attracted by what you might call the countercultural ethos of monasticism. They came, they went away, they told their friends, people came back. By the early 1970s, during the Easter vacations, there were already several thousands of young people arriving in this out-of-the-way village in rural France, far from the cities and far from the amenities of modern life. What to do with all of these young visitors? Well, the community, Brother Roger, first of all, and the community following him in a certain way, gave a very simple answer. We need to share with them what lies at the heart of our own life. That's what hospitality is about. That's a very obviously Christian value. It's also a very monastic value. And we all know, I think, hospitality is more than just offering a place to sleep and some food to eat. Real hospitality involves sharing what is most important for ourselves. So the experience we offered to the young visitors, let me just say in parentheses, when I say young, that's about today 85% of the people who come to Taizé are probably in that 16 to 30 age. There are adults, the others are adults, families, and so on. So it's not completely young, but the great majority is. So the experience we offer to these young visitors is basically what is the core of our own life, prayer and community. So let's turn to the question of prayer, the question of worship, because this is the focus of our time today. And obviously, as befits a monastic community, common prayer is at the center of life in Taizé. 3 times each day, the bells start ringing and everything stops. Everybody, whether the permanent residents or the visitors, heads for our church called the Church of Reconciliation for a time of prayer together lasting about 45 minutes, a little bit shorter at midday. In the evening, the prayer goes on with this meditative singing, and people come and go, and it can last as long as people wish. In the summer after midnight, you'll still find people praying and singing in the church. Worship in Taizé is rooted in the age-old monastic tradition. The services, in a certain sense, are classical in form. Service of the Word, psalms, scripture readings, intercessions, and maybe what's particular to us, not exclusive, but particular, is this long time of silence in the middle of the prayer. Now, we wanted to show you some images for those who have never been to Taizé. You had the prayer earlier. The problem is we have this video praying with the songs of Taizé, which I think is available from GIA for purchase. I had this memory that there was this long 3-minute piece of the prayer that you could say, well, that's not true. So we're doing a little snipping and pasting. There's about 1 minute of the prayer in Taizé. Then we shift to at the end of each year, we do a big European meeting where about 50,000 people come together in a European city. This year it's going to be in Brussels. So what you're going to see is 1 minute of the prayer in Taizé and about 1.5 minutes of one of the big European meetings, just to give you a feel for what I'm talking about. Okay? Okay, from there. How visible is it? It's a Saturday evening, a candlelight service that's beginning. Okay, we hit that there. European meeting. That's Father Joseph Gélineau, by the way, who just passed away. Jesuit composer who worked a lot with us. Okay. So, sorry we couldn't do more with the video aspect. I should have tried to get more footage. But anyway, just to give you a kind of an idea of the prayer, and as you could see, even when there were, 40,000 people in that room, the silence was very good. So, So when the numbers of young visitors began to increase, we were confronted by a challenge. The challenge was this: how could the worship be made more accessible? When I first went to Taizé, everything was in French. It was basically the Liturgy of the Hours, chanting the Psalms, scripture reading, silence, intercessions, but all in French, all sung, all very biblical, but not very accessible if you didn't know French and didn't know how to follow the book. So how could the worship be made more accessible while at the same time keeping that meditative, biblical sung quality? So we did different things, and one answer was these short refrains that are sung over and over again. The first ones were in Latin, and then we incorporated other languages that many people associate with Taizé now. We also, for the scripture, we had to choose more accessible and shorter scripture readings and read them in several languages, about 8 languages, probably during the summer months when there are a lot of people there. So one longer reading in English or French, and then the same text in a more brief way. And instead of singing entire psalms in French, verses are sung by soloists in different languages, and everyone responds with an antiphon such as Amen. At the same time, if the worship was intentionally made more accessible to young people, it remains the prayer of a monastic community. The young people know that it is not a prayer created especially for them, but that whether they are present or not, day in and day out, we brothers will still be in the church praying. So I think to their minds, this gives it a certain authenticity. It's not a prayer which is put on, a show which is put on for others. But at the same time, we have discovered that there's often a tendency to underestimate the ability of the younger generations to enter into a form of prayer which may be quite demanding. For example, at the heart of the prayer, as mentioned, after the scripture readings, we have a time of silence, at least 8 minutes, time to rest in God, a time to let the words that we have listened to and sung penetrate into our being, a time to keep maybe the worship from becoming routine. Now, 8 minutes of silence may not seem a long time to contemplatives who are used to silent prayer, but for the average churchgoer, and especially for young people, at first it can seem quite daunting. When does the noise ever stop in our society? People have these little machines now that they put in their ears so that it fills up all of the silent time. And what pastor would ever put 8 minutes of silence in Sunday Mass? What do you think would happen? It's got some kind of revolution. And yet in the summer months when we can have up to 5,000 visitors, mostly young in our church, you can hear a pin drop, as you might have seen there at the time of silence. This experience almost always affects the people deeply, and I think it should keep us from selling the young short. When they can understand the significance of a spiritual practice, our experience is they are ready and willing to take part. One misgiving that we sometimes hear about the prayer in Taizé, some people wonder whether it's a kind of prayer that plays on the emotions, kind of to give people a kind of superficial high, rather than helping people into a deeper encounter with God. It's certainly true that in Taizé we've always believed that worship isn't something cerebral, but involves the whole being. I think if you look at the history of worship in the Christian century, all the Christian centuries, and even today in the Eastern Church, in the Orthodox Church, liturgy should involve the whole being in a relationship with the source of life. In our community, using very simple means, candles, icons, soft lighting, a few bricks, a few pieces of cloth, we try to create a space that facilitates attentiveness and inner silence. We really believe that beauty is a gateway to the mystery of God. And of course, if we want it to be according to the gospel, that beauty should be linked to simplicity. And of course, our prayer is sung, again, the monastic tradition. And as in many religious traditions, the repetition of sung prayer helps to go beyond superficial rationality and go deeper into the core of our being. We started these repetitive chants for a practical purpose. They were a way of getting people who speak different languages to pray together. And then we discovered we were part of this age-old tradition, the Jesus prayer, the rosary, the mantras, the use of repetition to go beyond the kind of the surface. But on the other hand, I don't think the prayer in Taizé attempts to appeal specifically to the emotions. I would say that our prayer is rather low-key. It's quiet and meditative. It has little in common with some of the forms of prayer styles that people try to consciously use, especially to attract young people. In fact, it's even true that many of the participants need a day or two to enter fully into the rhythm of the prayer. This kind of prayer can be unsettling at first. It's not what they're used to. They're not used to sitting in silence, as we said. They're not used to singing, repeating words in different languages. Even though at the beginning they may be fascinated with the style and the beauty of the worship, it usually takes a little time to them to feel fully at home. That's why we ask people to stay for a week. And maybe that's because this kind of prayer calls out to a deeper level of being than what they're normally used to. They're challenged to discover a part of themselves often covered over by the busyness of contemporary life. They have to work a little bit, I think, to get to a place where they discover, in fact, that they are more fully themselves. At the same time, we don't want them to spend so much effort that they become discouraged and give up. So I think, and I'm not sure it's totally conscious on our part, but I think you could say that behind our prayer there's a kind of pedagogical intuition, maybe in the deepest meaning of the term. Like any good teacher, you need to give people something just a little bit harder for them, something they're a little bit not used to lead them on. So it can't be too far from what they're used to, but you don't just want to give them something they're already used to. So I think, again, not so much consciously, but if I reflect on our prayer, it tries to draw the young people and the visitors into a kind of new experience of meditation and prayer by giving them some helps to go further. One way in which this type of worship is often described is by saying that it implicitly communicates a sense of mystery. Maybe that's one way to talk about it. People talk a lot about that need today. And I think most of us would agree that in our modern or postmodern or whatever we call our present society, technological and consumer society, I think most people would agree that for all that we've achieved in terms of know-how and being able to control the universe, there's a lot of superficiality, a lot of reductiveness. Life is reduced to what can be measured or bought or sold. And I think we all realize that people are hungering, maybe unconsciously, but hungering for a rediscovery of the depths of life. And maybe that should be an important role of our churches and religious institutions today, to help people rediscover these depths using the millennia of experience that the great religious traditions have, so that they're not cheated. These young people or other people are not cheated by kind of counterfeit encounters with the sacred. And so maybe what people consider emotional, when people say your prayer is very emotional or something, they're just talking about what doesn't correspond to this very superficial and detached rationality. Maybe it's the idea of the reason and intellect that needs to be reframed rather than to talk immediately about emotion. I don't think, again, that our prayer is particularly emotional, but I bring that out because it is an objection we've heard sometimes. A word that many people, when you ask the young people what they like about the prayer, a word that many of them use is freedom. They say, I've heard this innumerable times, the prayer in Taizé is so free. And it really, at the beginning, left me perplexed. My sense of free prayer is something very different. The free prayer tradition for me is improvisation, people getting up and praying in their own words. And this is really the opposite extreme from Taizé. Our services are choreographed. They are put together in advance. The order of worship doesn't change. The only improvisation as such is the choice of the chants, but even that is chosen in a kind of organized way, usually. So what do they mean by saying the prayer is so free? Well, thinking about it, I sort of realized that they probably meant, in my language, that this prayer creates a space which leaves room for the body and the soul to breathe. First of all, the body. There are no pews in Taizé. We used to have chairs, but as soon as lots of people came and the church was getting full, we took out all the chairs and put carpeting on, and there's just some benches around the edges and some steps and so on. So most of the participants sit on the floor in a variety of postures or on these benches or so on. That's maybe freeing for them. They're not put into the structure of a pew. And then after the service, as I said, especially in the evening, the singing continues. There's no formal ending. Most of the brothers leave at a certain point, but some remain and the singing continues. So people can come and go as one wishes. People leave for a while, go to the snack bar in the evening, and then come back and join in the prayer again. And then you can also sing along when 5,000 people are singing. You can sing along or listen to the others singing and just be in your own silence. And again, the time of silence in the middle of the prayer is a space of freedom. You can fill it in your own way as long as you don't disturb others. We don't recommend snoring or singing during the silence. But other than that, it's a time just to breathe inwardly. So it's interesting. I think there's something to reflect on here, that the set organization of the prayer creates a framework that allows there to be an open space where our bodies, our minds, our hearts are liberated. So we discover, surprisingly, that structure and freedom need not be mutually opposed, but that one can favor the other. A certain kind of structure can favor a freeing up, a freedom. This, by the way, is something else that the monastic tradition has always known. The structure of a life shouldn't stifle freedom, but make freedom possible. Many people assume that people in the West today, especially young people, are impervious to liturgical symbolism. In our day, the vestments, the signs, the postures, the gestures used in the public prayer of the church that come down through the centuries has often seemed for many to be a closed book. Again, our experience in Taizé is rather that forms of symbolic expression, traditional ones even, still speak to people, provided that they are kept simple and provided that they, when necessary, are explained, though we tend to do our explanation outside of the service. We have a captive audience. They're there all day. That's why we can do the Bible studies and the explanations outside of the time of prayer. Just for example, for many years, we've celebrated what we call a weekly Easter. Every Friday is the day of the cross, and Saturday evening is a kind of resurrection vigil. So on Friday evening, we have what we call the prayer around the cross. We take a large icon of the cross, like the San Damiano cross, which was painted by one of our brothers. We take it and we bring it to the middle of the church and we lay it flat on some bricks. And then while the singing continues at the end of the prayer, all who wish to do so are invited to come up to the cross for a moment of silent prayer, while the singing continues, a few at a time, or they can put their forehead on the wood of the cross or touch the cross. And we had explained to them that this has various meanings. It can be a way of entrusting yourself to Christ as you are with all of your questions and doubts, and to go with Jesus on this road from death to life. It can especially be a way of praying in communion with all those who are suffering, people we know, friends, family, and people we don't know personally, and also entrust them to Jesus on his road from death to life. So they can make this gesture. And we found that this gesture is very meaningful to all kinds of people, not just those with an explicit liturgical background, but even those for whom such forms of expression are new. And on Saturday then, we give everyone a candle and a symbol of the light of the risen Christ. At the end of the prayer, as you saw a bit at the end, the children light their tapers and then go around the church and we pass the flame of the risen Christ to one another. Everyone passes then the flame to his or her neighbors as a way of, we've received this light from Christ and we're called to share it with others. And I think these very simple and basic kinds of symbols, the candles for Saturday, the prayer around the cross for Friday, seem to speak to people, give them access maybe to a dimension which normally they don't touch because it's been smothered by a culture that favors other kinds of communication. But it's there somehow if we can find the way to unlock it. Let me add a few other aspects now that I think are important to our prayer experience in Taizé. I've already mentioned the word simplicity. When you ask the young people what strikes them about their time in Taizé, they usually say one of three things. They talk about the prayer, they talk about the meeting with people their own age from all over the world, and the third thing is always the simplicity. Simplicity is certainly a Christian and monastic value. In fact, in Taizé, Brother Roger from the beginning preferred not to speak of poverty. Poverty is a more ambiguous term. It can mean different things, and so he spoke a lot more about simplicity. It was maybe a little more accessible. For us too, simplicity has practical value. It's linked to our choice to welcome everybody. If you decide you're going to welcome all those who come and not limit the numbers, then you've got to be very simple in the kind of welcome you offer. It also means we rely on our own work. Taizé has never accepted funding for our life. The brothers live from their own work. We make pottery, we print books, the music now and all of that. The visitors who come or give a small contribution for their upkeep, but there's no funding from other institutions or government or whatever. So that's part of the call to simplicity for us. So the young people emphasize the simplicity, and I think it seems to, for many, surprisingly, to be a refreshing change from their everyday life, where people are drowning in clutter, and nothing ever stops, where there are all kinds of possibilities, but sometimes all of those possibilities make it impossible just to be and to be together. And Taizé, there's lots of time to be and to be together, to meet other people. And so these visitors discover that you can be happy without living in a world of overabundance, and you can have a good time together without being burdened by expectations to meet or schedules to follow. People have always been struck by the fact that although a lot happens in Taizé, and if you follow the whole program, it's a very full day. At the same time, you don't have people feel free again because they don't have a sense of rushing from one thing to the next. There are no deadlines to meet. Things tend to be a little bit late, usually starting, but anyway, everything gets done, and a lot gets done. I like the Italian word. The Italians have a word which I don't think is in any other language. It's a synonym for simplicity. They call it essenzialità, which means, I guess you could loosely translate it, focusing on what really matters, what's essential. So I think this simplicity is very important in Taizé because it helps to create a certain atmosphere, an atmosphere of acceptance, an atmosphere of friendliness. Many people who come from large cities, and of course we know today, especially our cities are characterized by anonymity and by the fear of strangers. And so many are, one of the surprising things they tell us the first day, they're surprised to see that people say hello to one another. People speak to one another just while waiting in line for meals, and you make friends just by hanging around because of this place gives the feeling of safety. We're all there in this context of Christian community. So that during the week, and you see the change every week, during the week out of the hundreds or thousands of visitors, mostly younger people from many different countries, there's a kind of common belonging which is created. And then people have this sense of feeling part of a large family or a group of friends, even if you're certainly not able to meet every one of the 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people. But I think, to go back to our theme, this is one of the reasons why our worship is such a powerful experience for many. You often hear people complaining, certainly in this country and in Europe as well, about going to church in a parish and just being part of a large anonymous congregation with little human contact between the parishioners. On the other hand, when you pray with just a small group of people where you have chosen, there's another risk there. The risk is becoming somewhat limiting and sometimes even sectarian if it's just a closed small group. And I think, luckily, and not just due to ourselves, but for various reasons, our worship in Taizé seems to avoid both of those pitfalls. You pray together with many other people, again, a few hundred perhaps, and sometimes in a year a few thousand, and yet there is, despite that, a sense of intimacy in the church and a sense of fellowship that makes the prayer more intense. Possibly, again, this is true because at the center of the prayer, there is this group of brothers that are together in community 365 days a year. And so we're already a community, and we try to share this sense of community with others. Again, it's also because outside of the prayer, the people are together the whole day. They work together, they discuss together, they have fun together. So because of the specific structure of life in Taizé, there is no separation between worship and the rest of life. Now, obviously, this is not feasible in the average parish or congregation. Perhaps it's a bit more attainable on a college campus, especially a residential one. Something to think about. And in any case, if we look at the portrait of the first Christians we see in the New Testament, it's clear that praying together and sharing life are two sides of the same coin. Common prayer works best when it's the prayer of a community and not the prayer of a lonely crowd, as someone used the expression. So that's, I think, part of the reason that it works a bit more. And I'd like to mention, too, a final element, for what it's worth, and maybe some people have reflections on this, the worship in Taizé has almost no explicit didactic content. In Western Christianity, particularly in certain strands of Protestantism, preaching has tended to occupy more and more territory in worship over the centuries. In post-Reformation Europe, as we know, the architecture of church buildings was like a lecture hall, the pews in a straight line, all focused on the front, and in certain traditions, on the pulpit. Churches were practically indistinguishable from schoolrooms. Basically, the message is, this is a place to be instructed about the faith. There was, of course, a great concern in the post-Reformation Europe to form adult, theologically literate believers, and this took precedence over the desire to celebrate the mystery of God, which is beyond anything our minds can grasp. Of course, it's a question of balance. Of course, we don't have to choose between one or the other. The two desires are not mutually exclusive. Reflection on the Word of God has always been an essential part of the Christian liturgy. But we have to say that in the West, after the Reformation, and again, more visible in Protestantism, because Protestantism is less burdened, if that's the word, with the ballast of the centuries of the tradition. So in the last centuries, the balance has shifted really a lot in the direction of the rational organization of liturgy, verbal communication, and of course you had some hymn singing for a certain emotional release. But it basically was a lecture hall with some hymns, no? As I said, in Taizé there are no pews, so we got out of that structure. Father Gélineau, who you saw briefly on the text, had a big reflection one day. He was a kind of philosopher as well as a musician, and he was in Taizé once and had a big reflection. He may even talk about it on this tape, about the sense of time in Taizé, and he said, you've gone back to a pre-modern model of time in your liturgy in Taizé, and it's the only place in the Western Church where I found this, for what it's worth. That's Father Gélineau. So there's no pews. The seating is a bit chaotic. As you see, people are done everywhere. And to the surprise of not a few visitors, there is no preaching. No preaching in the prayer in Taizé during the services. Now, obviously, the first reason is practical. There's no one language. It would be rather hard. You have to set up a whole... We do have once a week, Brother Alois or Brother Roger before him speaks in the church to everyone, and then it takes a long time to set up a system of simultaneous translations. However, the other reason is, as I said, we have a captive audience, and so every day people get 45 minutes of input by a brother talking about Scripture and giving a talk, which then is followed up in small groups and questions and silence and small group discussion. So there is time for reflecting on the Word. It just doesn't take place in the liturgy as such. We have the time to offer the worship and the teaching. We don't have to do it at the same time. But I think, again, not something that can be, because of the constraints of a parish situation or other situations, not something that can be imitated everywhere, but I think it has some advantages because this kind of prayer can awaken a different dimension of people's beings than comes to light in a teaching situation. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the worship of the Eastern Church, the Eastern Rite churches, the Orthodox Church, and so you'll understand what I mean. When you participate in an Orthodox service, you slowly enter into another dimension. Again, the sense of time is very different. The repetitive chanting, the icons, the incense, the gestures of the priest and of the congregation. Little by little, you're drawn out of the mundane world and you enter into the mystery of God. They like to talk about this as heaven's joy on earth. Again, it's not a matter, certainly it's not a matter of gimmicks, it's not a matter of manipulating people, but of creating a space where another part of our being can breathe. And I think if so many young people find this kind of style, the style we have in Taizé and in other traditions, if they find it freeing, even though it's very rooted in Christian tradition, perhaps that should help us to reflect on the meaning and the end of worship. Again, Taizé doesn't want to be a model to be imitated, but we do hope our experience can offer food for thought for anyone who's looking for meaningful ways of praying in the current context. So I hope these remarks have helped to give you a sense of what we do and why, and I'd really be welcome to hear your own insights and questions and so on. So I think we have something like 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes if you want to get some feedback here. I'd be happy to speak and have a conversation. Yes? Yeah, sure. The link between the prayer, the community, and the visitors, and this question of social involvement, social justice, and all of that. Certainly for us, we've never, for example, defined ourselves as a contemplative community. And if you look at Brother Roger's writings from the beginning, he said, he has a book called Struggle and Contemplation. So it was always, prayer and being present to others, being present to those who are last in society and so on, are two sides of the same coin. I think the reason for coming to Taizé, you see that. He came first to Taizé to welcome refugees, and then secondly with the idea of starting a community. So certainly in the thinking, those two go together. In Taizé, we have these communities of brothers, like the brothers in Bangladesh and Senegal, or small communities, much more rooted in the local situation and working with the people and so on for different problems that come up through their life. In Taizé, we do it on the level of thinking. There are workshops each day. Aside from the Bible studies, there are workshops. Some of the workshops could be about themes like immigration or, how to create a society, how to live the faith in the city, or, there are social themes that are talked about. In our area, in the past, the brothers were involved locally. Today, there's not a lot we do because there's not a lot to be done. It's a rural area, which is kind of changing a lot of secondary homes and stuff. So the young people who come are certainly made aware that prayer it's not just the prayer. Prayer is part of a larger whole of the Christian life. We have welcomed into the village, we've welcomed families into the village. We welcomed a family from Rwanda who live there now. We welcomed a family from Sarajevo during the Bosnian War who still live there. So we've tried to make gestures in that way, but in a place like Taizé, an out-of-the-way monastic community, it's a bit limited, in that sense, concretely. Yeah.
Has there ever been a women's monastic group at Taizé?
There have always been women's communities with whom we've been associated. So when Brother Roger started, before him actually, in the late 30s, a group of women in the Reformed tradition started a community called the Community of Grand Champ, which still exists in Neuchâtel. And the first years they were a kind of sister community, but they remained in Switzerland. And we visited them last year when we had our meeting in Geneva. So they're still kind of related. But for the last 40 years, there's been a community of sisters in Taizé who came from Belgium called the Sisters of St. Andrew. And they do a lot of the work with us today. And then lately we have now we have 3 communities of women. There are two smaller communities. Community of Ursuline sisters from Poland, because when Eastern Europe opened up, we had some problems with welcoming young people from Russia and Poland and those countries. So we asked these sisters to come and be with us. And then just recently, some sisters of St. Vincent de Paul have come to help with the infirmary, especially in the summer and so on. So we've always had those kinds of relationships. Brother Roger never was in a situation where he felt he needed to start something for women. It just didn't happen because there were always these communities of women. Sure. That's right. Well, now it depends. In the winter, a bit less because there aren't so many children sometimes from the village. But during the summer, when we have a family group in Taizé too. Families can come with their young children for a week. limited number, but we can welcome some families. And so some of those children during the prayer remain around. It used to be Brother Roger and now Brother Alois. And that's something that people always remark on. I think it's a good example of what I was saying about symbols that start, you don't know exactly how. I think it probably started, Brother Roger always had this sense of kinship with little children, because he was had this simplicity and sort of felt at home with little children. And I think probably it started in a kind of spontaneous way one day that he might have invited, there were some children in the church, he invited them to come and pray around him. And then he just probably had this intuition that he felt comfortable. When he's surrounded by children, he always felt more comfortable. He went to the United Nations once to speak to the Secretary General. He brought these little children with him because I think to make a symbol of the future of the world, but also because he felt more at home with these little children in this situation. So I think it's partly that, but I think he felt it really was a symbol, in a way when in this world of expertise and efficiency and all of that, and to say, no one's an expert in prayer. Jesus says, become like little children, and here they are, and they're generally pretty good. We give them coloring books and papers to write on and stuff so they don't rate. And sometimes their mother has to come and take them away, but most of the time they're, again, even little children, they're incredibly part of the thing, and they're given responsibility. They're the ones who, you saw that, they're the ones who light the candles. Sometimes they have to, they bring, now we changed, we just added, they bring up the gifts at the Sunday Eucharist to the offertory, so it's all these 3 or 4 little children who bring up the gifts and the candles, and it's very nice. So these things grow, but then you discover that they speak to people, because so many people notice that. Yes? Right. Okay, so just run you through it. So the morning prayer is at 8:30. After morning prayer, there's breakfast. And then at about 10 o'clock, people go into groups of 100 or 200 people, a little bit by age, a little bit by language, and get an introduction, Bible reflection by one of the brothers, or sometimes the sisters help with that with the adults. They do that. And then after that, many people would have a time of silence for the rest of the morning, or sometimes it could be small group discussion. Then at midday, there's the prayer, followed by lunch. At 2 o'clock, there's usually a song practice that for those who want, that goes on for an hour. In the middle of the afternoon, about 3:30, small groups. So if the people who didn't discuss in the morning would discuss in the afternoon. At a little bit later, there's tea at 5 o'clock. After tea, there are some workshops. If you're interested, they're optional for people, specific themes. And then supper is at 7, and evening prayer is at 8:30. And as I said, can go on till midnight if you like. You can stay in the church as long as you want. Some people choose to work a half day, so they would have the discussion and the reflection in the morning or in the afternoon, and then do practical work the rest of the day, because with so many people there, we need people to clean up and to do all the kind of stuff that you need to run things. So that's the visitors. The brothers, depends on our work. We also have the 3 times of prayer. We have our main meal at midday in silence with music, and then the rest depends a lot on the work of the brothers. Some are more involved with the visitors, and some doing the pottery workshop or something, and so they have more, hours that are more fixed.
At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that when one has spent a week with them, they go back to their reality. And I was just wondering, for people, once they have spent a week with you and have this incredible experience, what do they report it's like to go back to their family? How do they bring what they started to do back?
Okay. Often if it's their first visit and they don't come, there are people who come by themselves or just with a couple friends, and there are people who come with a group, sometimes with their priest or teacher or something like that. If they come on their own and it's their first time, they generally have a hard time making the link with their life at home. So they may, for a while, they say they kind of live off of that high or whatever you want to call it, that sort of sense of thing, and then it's kind of harder. But if they come back again, little by little, either they don't come back anymore, or else they look for a concrete way of, some kind of group or parish or something where they can make a link with their daily life. The ones who come with a group are a little bit more fortunate, because if you have a good group leader, pastor or animator or whatever, and sometimes, they come and then when they go home, they reflect on the experience, and then they think about, okay, how can we continue something, not imitate Taizé, but if something, we always ask them to do this. Say, what was important for you here? That's the first question. And so you think about that, and then you say, well, how can I put that into my life where I am? Not imitating what we do, but taking that theme. If simplicity is the thing, if silence is the thing, if prayer is the thing, well, that's got to be possible where you are in a different way. And also if it's a group, I always say, wait a couple weeks, digest the experience, let it settle, and then think about what you might do. And one of the obvious way that people can find a link is by creating a prayer somewhat similar to what we did, either weekly or monthly. And in a lot of places, there are in cities prayers. In Italy, for example, which I know a bit better, in most of the big cities, there's usually someplace there's a monthly prayer for anyone interested in praying in this style. But that's the easier one in a certain way, because that's concrete. The harder thing is, I think, for each person to say in their own life how to continue something that may have been opened up, and that's a lot of people do. They tell us afterwards. By coming to Taizé, that was part of a journey that led them to certain choices in their life and to certain, commitments, Christian commitments, and probably there are others who don't, and they don't come back, and we don't see them. We don't know. We don't really have statistics about that.
You mentioned a Sunday Eucharist. How does that work when you have folks from all different Christian confessions there together?
Right. That's squaring the circle, right? Because it's not something we can solve, because, as you know, the churches are not one yet, and that's where you see that we've done different things over the years. Right now, there's a daily Mass for those who wish early in the morning, Catholic Mass, because many Catholics want daily Mass, so there's a daily Mass, but it's not for everyone. It's for those who wish, because it's an ecumenical setting. At the end of morning prayer, we also distribute the communion to those who wish, and we distribute, again, because many Catholics have the daily Eucharist, and we also took the Orthodox custom of blessed bread. The Orthodox offer blessed bread at the end of their service so that everyone can be associated, even those who don't take the body and blood of Christ. So we offer blessed bread. It's marked that it's blessed bread and not, we explain it at the beginning of the week, and so people can do that. There are during the week, if there's an Anglican group or an Orthodox group, if Orthodox come with a priest, say from Russia or from Romania, they would probably celebrate their liturgy one day during the week, not for everyone, but again at a time when it's not bothering the schedule, maybe early in the morning. On Sunday now we have the Catholic Mass, but with the blessed bread for those who wish. So, and because again it's for the Catholics, it's important. So we try. That's what we do now. So, and it works right now, but it's a little bit like squaring the circle, as I said. Yeah.
Can you speak to, I guess, it's an ecumenical place, but can you speak to the relationship of the Taizé community with the Roman Catholic Church? Because it seems that there is some kind of a special, not special, like specifically chosen, but there is some kind of back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
Brother Roger meet the Pope.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, being an ecumenical community, again, in this country it's hard for some people to understand because you have these non-denominational churches, which people confuse with, which means you do your own thing, sort of you're just a church and you accept everybody, but you're not really concerned with the different denominations, whereas Taizé was more in that struggle for Christian unity, So the brothers from the beginning tried to have good relationships with all the churches, basically, with their own, the First Brothers Reformed Church, and with their own background, which wasn't easy, you might think, because, being a monastic adventure in the middle of the Reformed Church, it wasn't, at the beginning wasn't, the idea of celibacy, the commitment to celibacy, for example, took a lot of time for people to understand. Now there's a whole new generation, we don't have those kinds of problems, but in the early days, that was a big problem. The breakthrough with the Catholic Church came with the 50 years ago this last month, the election of Pope John the 23rd. When Pope John the 23rd was elected, the Archbishop of Lyon said to Brother Roger, I'm going to make you an appointment with the new Pope because it's really important. And Brother Roger was the first audience the Pope gave after his being elected, after he was crowned. I think in those days he was still crowned, so after his coronation. And they got along really right away. They were on the same wavelength. In fact, we just had a prayer in Sotto il Monte, which is the birthplace of John the 23rd, last month with the secretary, of Pope John, who was still alive, was 93 years old, and was talking about Brother Roger and Pope John. It was a wonderful time. About 1,500 people showed up. So with Pope John, there was this not institutional, but he understood what the brothers were trying to do. And from then on, he spoke every year with Brother Roger, and Pope Paul VI continued, and Pope John Paul II continued, and the current Pope has received Brother Alois, who's now our founder, every year, also in a personal audience. So there's a lot of trust built up over the years, and a lot of respect, I think. I think the current Pope really respected, you can tell he really respected Frère Roger, Brother Roger, and so we have a good relationship. Yeah.
I was wondering if, I'm thinking about your many years in Taizé, you would share with us maybe a favorite story, an anecdote, or something you've heard back from someone who's been there, and that about a way that their experience of Taizé, and the liturgy there, has had a real strong effect transforming their lives. Is there any particular anecdote or story that is a favorite of yours to share with what you've heard back?
I hate these questions because no, they're great, but I always draw a blank. No, when I think of no, there's one that comes to me. A young woman from Italy who told me this many years later. We have these yearly meetings at the end of the year in a European city because the idea was not just Taizé as a magical place, but we can work with the parishes and so on. So there was this meeting in Paris. So her friend says to her, they were, I don't know what they were, 20 years old or something. Her friend says, well, let's go to Paris for New Year's. There's this meeting. There's this religious thing there. We can get there's a bus. It won't cost us very much. We can go to this meeting. So she says, fine, great. So let's go to Paris for New Year's. So they get on the bus and they go with these crowds of people, and they kind of have a good time being tourists in Paris. And then before the meeting was over, they said, well, maybe we should go to one of the services, because we should really, So they walk in at the time, but they were in the churches. We weren't yet in the exhibition halls because the numbers were a little lower. And it was Saint-Sulpice in Paris. So they walk into this church with one of these prayers going on, and she said it was like boom, like she was really like overturned. So it just stopped her and all this. So then she decided she wanted to come to Taizé. So the next year she came to Taizé and spent a week, and then she told me this many years later, and now she's married and has kids. But after that she became very involved in her parish and kind of reawakened her faith. She was a sort of nominal Catholic, but and it was just walking into a church where people were praying in this way. So that's an example that comes to mind. I don't know. Yeah.
What draws new members of the community? I find it interesting you keep saying that it's monastic, but in some ways it seems like the least monastic of Taizé, because the doors are always open and you're at least alone. So do folks come because they want to work with young people, or what? What is it that draws them?
Well, there are not two populations, that those who come to join. I mean, the people who come thinking to join the community usually don't stay, I think. The people who come, like myself, when I first came after college, I spent a year traveling around Europe. I'd heard of this place. It intrigued me. I went for a week, had a really great experience. They said you should come back. It was a quiet time. They should come back when there were lots of people, so I came back and experienced that. Stayed a while to help. We have about 60 or 70 in the summer more volunteers, young men and women who spend the summer, who spend 6 months, who spend a year. So among the thousands of young people who come to Taizé, some feel especially drawn, and some want to stay a longer time, usually a summer or a month in the summer, or sometimes for a year. And some of those, so you're getting, some of those are, after being there, anyone who stays longer than a couple weeks speaks personally with a brother or a sister every week, has a sign to a brother or a sister to have an ongoing relationship. So some of those people who stay a longer time, usually it comes out in what are they searching for and all of that. And some of them, it comes out they're looking for or they discover, they might not have even, that they're looking for some kind of deeper commitment. And those are the ones who usually, in the end, make the decision to stay. So it's about 2 or 3 a year, so to give you a sense of proportion. If you have 50,000 people pass through Taizé each year, get 2 or 3. So it's not like, leaps and bounds, but that's enough. We're not interested in becoming a bigger community. Do we have time for one more question, or that's it? Is there one? Yeah, sure. Anyone? Well, maybe we don't need to. I thought people had their hands up, but okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.